The Sword in the Neck by Yanis Ekbel. Reading of the Alaska Flood. This is, I think, right in line with what we're talking about here today, actually. 27 Club, welcome in. Good to see you. So we're reading today from page 101, or rather, page 76, 75 on your physical copy. Everybody go follow my comrade 27 Club. Great to see you, comrade. I hope you're doing well. You're just in time for a based reading segment. Chapter 4 of Sword in the Neck. Etienne Balibar and the Politics of Impotence. We're about to call out some liberal bullshit. Complainy, welcome in. Also follow fellow Tank 2 partner Complainy.
I've got some literature in my car that will change
Yo,
your
and
whole way of
thank you so much for the resubby, comrade. I very much appreciate your support. Hell yeah. Chapter 4, Etienne Balibar and the Politics of Impotence. On February 29th, 2024, the Israeli army deliberately ran over a Palestinian man in Gaza City's Al Zaytun neighborhood after he was arrested. The man was harshly interrogated by Israeli soldiers who tied his hands with plastic zip handcuffs before running him over with a military vehicle from the legs up. In order to ensure that he was thoroughly crushed, Israeli soldiers laid him on the asphalt instead of the adjacent sandy area. The man had his clothes removed since he was seen wearing only his underpants. When one looks at the body, one is confronted with the absolute unidentifiability of the man that it previously constituted. The individuality of the human being has been flattened into scattered, disfigured organs and parts. Thus bringing us to the first part, colonial reality. How are we to think about the comprehensively destroyed body? In mainstream liberal thought, the evisceration of a human being can be regarded as a moral failing, as a loss of lives that has to be prevented. Palestinians here figure merely as victims of terror. Their redemption, consequently, lies in the normative abstraction of peace. The body of the victim is sensationalized and marketed as a blot upon the fabric of humanity so that people can be convinced in favor of the cessation of hostilities. Politics is reduced to outrage, while collective action is postponed to the day when everyone's moral conscience has awoken. When this spontaneous moral awakening does not happen, a sense of helplessness pervades. All this while the individual can pride themselves over their distance from the violence of Hamas, which is considered as a myopic outburst without any political vision. This is clear in renowned Marxist philosopher Etienne Balibar's response to the Palestine crisis. He says that Hamas's October 7th military operation cannot be justified because it was, quote, accompanied by particularly odious crimes against the Israeli population, the murder of adults and children, torture, rape, and kidnapping. From Etienne Balibar Till Death, Palestine. These extremist massacres replicated the massacres perpetrated by the Jewish paramilitaries on Palestinian villages during the Nakba. from Etienne Balibar, Palestine, Ukraine, and other wars of extermination, the local and the global, from Bison Lecture Series, Association de Universités pour le Respect de Droit International en Palestine, December 10th, 2023. There's a link to it here in this book. And you can get a link to this book by going to iskrabooks.org, by the way. Essentially, all of the supposed atrocities committed by Hamas have been debunked. Most of the 1,154 Israelis that the government claims were killed by Palestinians were actually killed by the Zionist state itself. Asa Winstanley, Israel killed Israelis, confirms new 7th of October documentary by the Electronic Intifada. This is the result of Israel's Hannibal Directive, which authorized the killing of Israeli soldiers and, in practice, civilians if they fall into enemy hands. The story about the killing of babies was propagated without evidence. Richard Sanders and Al Jazeera Investigative Unit, being based on the words of Major David Ben Zion, an extremist settler who is explicitly called for violence against Palestinians, by David Reed. Claims about rape were established through a fraudulent New York Times investigation, which was published even though not a single rape victim was found. The reality of any remaining crimes committed by Hamas had been so obscured by the incessant Zionist propaganda as to be rendered impossible to judge. At the same time, and ever since the beginning of Operation Alaska Flood, the reality of the extreme and genocidal acts of Israeli forces, which outweigh even the most severe accusations thrown at Hamas by orders of magnitude, are routinely downplayed, obscured, and ignored by the Zionist forces and the Western media, despite overwhelming evidence. Babies have been beheaded by Israeli bombs. Civilians have been deliberately targeted in hospitals, schools, ambulances, and refugee camps. Entire families have been burned alive under rubble. The Israeli military has used civilians as human shields, forced evacuations only to bomb evacuation routes, and dropped white phosphorus on densely populated areas. Every Zionist accusation becomes a confession. The propaganda does not merely lie, it reveals what it is desperate to hide. It tells us precisely what crimes the Israeli state is committing by displacing them onto the people it seeks to annihilate. A strategy, comrades, as old as time. Balibar's willingness to accept the demonization of Palestinian resistance is rooted in the aforementioned logic of liberal peace, wherein clean, uncluttered thought is prioritized over the spiraling movement of anti-colonial resistance. Any counterattack on Zionist settler colonialism is said to be caught within the confines of the extant social reality. Palestinians and Israelis, then, become two sides of an overarching situation, continuously mirroring each other in terms of their deplorable violence. An exit from this situation can be conceived only in an external manner, as the intervention of a supervening agency. Thus, Balibar says that the only possible outcome consists in the intervention of the international community and its institutions. quote, demanding an immediate ceasefire, the release of the hostages, the prosecution of the war crimes committed by both sides, and the implementation of the countless UN resolutions that have gone unheeded. And that is from Balibar Till Death, Palestine, which is going to be this whole page pretty much. Ah, yes, the violence committed on both sides. By the way, speaking of the UN, before I continue, I just want to make a note here and say that according to UN international law itself, Israel has no right to defend itself by Palestinian anti-colonial violence. That's international law, even. Anyway, I continue. But he himself adds that this desired resolution has no chance of happening because, quote, institutions have been neutralized by the major or medium-sized imperialist powers, and the Jewish-Arab conflict has once again become an issue in the maneuvers they engage in to determine spheres of influence and networks of alliances in the context of cold and hot wars. Balibar, same work. Geopolitical and regional power dynamics, quote, obliterate any effective international legality. We are in a circle of impotence and calculation from which there is no escape. The catastrophe will therefore carry to term, and we will suffer the consequences. 10. Again, Balibar, same fucking book. Impotence. Impotence. This becomes the face of the liberal pacifist strategy that wants to separate the Palestinian question from any contaminating influence of concrete geopolitical and social actors. In order to build an alternative to Balibar's anti-politics of impotence, consider these words by him. Quote, I see the massacre on October 7th, involving various atrocities perpetrated against civilians, as a pure terrorist action. Note here, also in the literal sense, meant to spread terror, which forces confer a terrorist character upon the organization itself. Again, Balibar. Instead of disavowing this characterization, I want to interpret it literally. Yes, a war of national liberation does intend to spread terror among the settlers, so that the sense of security enjoyed by the colonial system can be upended. Colonial society, in its entirety, should be woken out of this racist insularity by being forced to pay the price of occupation. Just as the colonized pay the price for national oppression. Terror should be felt on both sides. When anti-colonial practice inflicts damage upon structures of brutality through the deployment of terror, the entire alliance of imperialist states comes together to contain the movement. Therefore, when Balibar says that a terrorist character should be conferred upon Hamas, he forgets that this has already been done through sanctions and terror lists created by the states of the global north. But these instruments of repression have had a counterproductive effect, introducing a form of delinking among the entities that are at the receiving end of imperialist strangulation. In the words of Max Elge, as political organizations were maximally coerced and quarantined, they made mutual linkages. Delinking led to a type of regional collective self-reliant security doctrine, architecture, and technological and military coordination. Imperialism built an inadvertent scaffolding for its opponents' ideological and political goals. from Max Algel, Palestine's Great Flood. Thus, anti-colonial terror lays bare the contours of confrontation, imposing upon us a stark divide of national liberation and imperialism. Operation Alaska Flood has heightened the antagonism between the colonizer and the colonized, with the entire globe feeling the reverberations of this binary's division. As the divide between national liberation and colonialism is sharpened, amplified, and simplified, one cannot say that both the sides are involved in a cycle of violence, wherein each mimes the other in the performance of cruelty. In order to say that the colonizer and the colonized are similar in terms of their violent acts, one has to compare this violence against a common standard of peace. But the peculiarity of colonialism consists in the fact that there is no unified notion of peace. Frantz Fanon elaborates, quote, "A zone inhabited by the colonized is not complementary to the zone inhabited by the colonizers. The two zones confront each other, but not in the service of a higher unity. Governed by a purely Aristotelian logic, they follow the principle of mutual exclusion. There is no conciliation possible. One of the terms is superfluous. Fanon, the wretched of the earth. Since Balibar wants to establish a similarity between the violence of Hamas and Israel, he has to acknowledge that he is comparing both these forms of violence from a higher standpoint of peace. And this is exactly what he does. He writes that the aim of Hamas's October 7th attack was, quote, to provoke a response of such violence that the war would enter a new, truly exterminationist phase, obliterating forever the possibilities of the two people living together. Balibar, till death, Palestine. Fucking gross. That's a Larry note added in there. Possibilities. 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 This is a key word of liberal ideology, as it presupposes that the colonial situation always contains a reservoir of morality, a hope of reconciliation. Can we think about what we were watching from that prominent democratic socialist earlier? What did we hear earlier? That it was against Trumpism, against Trumpist fascism, and not the party that forms the same party as Trumpist fascism in the form of the Democratic Socialists, but no, we have to save the Democrats from the establishment Democrats. That's what is yelled at colonized people here in the US and in Canada in regards to the NDP. Because literally, what was the argument? That's the only thing possible. Right? Literally. There is no other possibility other than that. Possibilities. This key word of liberal ideology. It presupposes that the colonial situation always contains a reservoir of morality, a hope of reconciliation. That is the difference between a Chairman Africa and a Democrat socialist streamer. However, colonialism is an irreconcilable struggle between two opposing forces. Even if Hamas had remained completely quiet, Israel would have maintained its genocide of Palestinians. Settler sovereignty can only be ensured through the perpetually enacted destruction of indigenous presence. The mere fact of Palestinian existence is a threat to Israel. Hamas's military operations do not determine the character of the Israeli response. The response of Israel is ingrained in the structure of colonialism, which mandates the extermination of the native. This is why Balibar is wrong to say that Operation Alaska Flood has erased the possibilities of peace. There never was such a possibility. In a colonial situation, possibilities are created by cracking open the shell of frozen impossibilities. In other words, this is another Larry note. In other words, Operation Alaska Flood is what opened up the possibility of peace, not the other way around. To continue, this brings me back to the dismembered body of the Palestinian man. The colonial violence enacted upon this body cannot be judged against a higher notion of morality, as colonialism drives back all ethereal ideological words into the soil of struggle. In order to understand the crushed body, one has to analyze the concrete causes that have brought about this kind of death. Without these causes, we will end up in the fantasy world of liberal ethics, where everything is subordinated through the judgmental gaze of contemplative observer. Here, it is instructive to read Nikolai Bukharin's explanation of materiality to the body. Quote, "Now man is a very delicately organized creature. Destroy this organization, disorganize it, take it apart, cut it up, and the mind at once disappears. If men were able to put together this system again, to assemble the human organism, in other words, if it were possible to take a human body apart and put it together again, just as one may do with the parts of a clock, consciousness would also at once return. Once the clock has been reassembled, it will operate and start to tick. Put together the human organism and it will start to think." Nikolai Bukharin, Historical Materialism, A System of Sociology. Cosmonaut Press, 2021. Comparing a body to a clock. This seems to offend the sensibilities of liberal morality, where humanity is constantly touted as an inviolable construct. However, a mechanical perspective is appropriate for the politics of anti-colonialism, where one mourns not the violation of the body's humanity, but its disorganization by specific actors. In politics, the disorganized body is reassembled through collective action, through the gathering of the masses that preserves the desire for life through concrete practices of disobedience and construction. This organized mass targets the entity that is responsible for the disorganization of bodies, namely the Zionist state. If violence needs to be deployed in the struggle against colonialism, then it is fully justified. It is simply an instrument that assists in the reassembly of bodies through the disassembly of the colonial enemy. Lenin, welcome in. Everybody go follow Lenin Smash. Which brings us to the next part. What do you think so far, chat? Is this hitting? Is this hitting for you? Ones in chat if this is hitting. Strategies of civility. Balibar believes that violence is not a mere instrument. In his book, Violence and Civility, on the limits of political philosophy, he states that, quote, political violence can never be completely controlled. One cannot simply use it as a means in the service of a certain ends, without oneself feeling the ambivalent effects of its use, deliberate or not. Balibar. Violence, accordingly, can no longer be thought as, quote, a means or an instrument employed to accomplish something else. It is rather an uncertain stakes of a confrontation with an element of irreducible alterity that it carries within itself. From Balibar again. This irreducible alterity refers to the fact that violence exceeds the presupposes guaranteeing it a permanent place in the economy of power and production. Again, Balibar. It is never entirely functional, as it exceeds the intentions and escapes the control of those exercising the violence. Man, this is some liberal bullshit. Balibar again. This Balibar really should just shut the fuck up already. this functionality. This is the type of Marxism, again, that we're fighting with. That is reflected in the democratic socialist strategy. I want you to understand that, right? What we're talking about here, Etienne Balibar, and this politics that they're espousing is directly linked and tied to the democratic socialist entryist strategy of just peacefully bringing about socialism. Nah. We know that can't happen because us peacefully building economic alternatives leads to state violence employed against us. We already know that. For some reason, the Democratic Socialists and the Social Democrats, as well-meaning as some of them might be, do not understand this. And will go so far as to get themselves killed without understanding that. Look at Rosa Luxemburg and Karl. This grand narrative can be summarized in the thesis of convertibility of violence. The consequences of the most massive acts of destruction are ruins and mourning, but they cannot not be constructive or reconstructive even as they destroy. From Balibar again. The historical optimism or faith in the meaning of history has been lost with the defeat of revolutionary projects. These projects practice counterviolence, which Balibar classifies as a simplistic intervention of ruling class violence. Socialist revolutions believe that they must duplicate bourgeois violence if they are to properly monopolize it. All of this is Balibar. This whole page is Balibar ranting on, so be ready. This monopolization is dangerous for the very people who wield and institute them. Why? Because they are nothing other at the limits than crystallized or stabilized violence, and in the final analysis, the relative stabilization by groups and individuals in a given society of their own violence in the form of a distantiation and unequal distribution, a more or less permanent appropriation of the means of violence by some of them. Balibar believes that the hierarchical foundation of revolutionary counterviolence, its status as an unequal distribution of force, was overlooked due to the construction of a grand narrative. Namely, class struggle as the motor of history. This narrative of history demarcated a new division between revolutionary violence and counter-revolutionary violence. The latter was excluded from the meaning of history, and it was regarded as an obstacle to the revolution. Insofar as revolutionary projects dogmatically justified their violence through the construction of facile grand history, they failed to engage with the legitimate disagreements and antagonisms. Any dynamic that didn't agree with state policy was classified as counter-revolutionary. This initiated a truly suicidal process of increasing repression. Oh, brother. State institutions and police apparatuses in socialist societies came to replicate the hierarchical structure of the enemies against whom they were fighting. According to Balibar, globalization has operated a practical refutation of the grand schemes of intelligibility of politics. Both bourgeois and post-revolutionary states depended upon the primacy of the nation, which functions as a form of collective subjectivity, integrating individuals in a process of historical universality, patriotism, civic duty, etc. Insofar as globalization has diminished the significance of the nation, it has destroyed the myth of a unified history. Today, events no longer unfold as part of an evolving chain of meaningful collective actions. Conflicts no longer oppose a negative to a positive. Rather, the intrinsic complexity or order of multiplicity that characterizes conflict introduces a new reality that can't be captured by the binaries of revolutionary counterviolence. These binaries assume that conflict would birth progress. However, progress has been replicated by the explosion of myriad forms of extreme violence, environmental catastrophe, ethnic wars, etc., that do not contribute to any grand narrative. This form of violence that is not part of the universal meaning of history is inconvertible violence, i.e., violence that cannot be incorporated into a teleological narrative. Inconvertible violence shows that totalizing discourses will always fail in their attempt to convert all violence into social stability. As inconvertible remainder inevitability haunts the unity of grand narratives, as Balibar remarks, the history of society, or the field of politics, is that of an excess or irreducible remainder of violence, if only latent violence, over the institutional, legal, or strategic forms of reducing and eliminating it. It's all from the same fucking book. Insofar as inconvertible violence lies outside the justifactory web of totalizing discourses, it directly attests to the entanglement of politics with antagonisms. The fact that politics is not a stable and absolute idea, but a form of fragile power relation. This fragility is present in extreme violence, which is shorn of any larger narrative of progress. Consequently, extreme violence is faced with the abyss of indeterminacy, the inability of a justification to permanently ground politics. Instead of accepting the intermittency of politics, extreme violence aims to tear apart social bonds in order to generate security. That is why it targets, quote, the humanity in man, the very fact of inclusion in the human race, an impossible task that needs to be repeated in order to guarantee the temporary sense of omnipotence. Extreme violence thus reveals an incomprehensible minimum, an excess that cannot be eliminated. Individuality is not a simple totality, which could be circumscribed in a unique discourse, a unique way of life. There always remains an indefinite multiplicity of parts, relationships, fluctuations, which exceed such an imaginary project, and wind up subverting it. Balibar asks us to accept the groundlessness of politics that is revealed in the preserved fashion by the anxieties of extreme violence, instead of eliminating the threat of conflicts, which extreme violence tends to do. We should accept the fundamental conflictuality of politics itself. Not all violence can be converted into teleological social order. There always remains an inconvertible remainder that disturbs the stability of discourses. The end for which we want to deploy violence are overpowered by the excess of violence that we wrongfully regulate to mere means. Balibar writes, quote, violence cannot simply be the other side of politics. Unless we want to imagine a politics without powers, power relations, inequalities, conflicts, or interests, which would be tantamount to politics without politics. The acknowledgement of violence is a conflictual dynamic that cannot be suppressed points us towards a precariousness of politics. The fact that it cannot be guaranteed once and for all by a grand historical narrative. Instead, politics is constituted by an infinite circularity. Political action depends on its own movement of permanent negotiation, instead of being subordinated to an invariant foundation. When this circularity is ignored, we enter the realm of extreme violence, where one engages in the impossible search for a metaphysical foundation. As Balibar puts it, quote, we need to conceive of politics as an absolute fiction, or an institution with no foundation, that is necessarily and irremediably contingent. The sole foundation is a negative one. Terror or extreme violence, or a combination of the forms of extreme violence, which is precisely terror. The alternative, it is the aleatory, purely practical possibilities of avoiding terror, of deferring it more or less completely, and for the relatively protracted period. The aleatory mode of politics leads to civility, quote unquote, wherein politics does not renounce the imperative of liberatory violence, but attempts to combat its nihilism through careful controls. Is this sounding familiar to anything we heard earlier regarding us revolutionaries being nihilistic, for being critical of reformism? Oh, are we seeing a source? Again, it all comes back to Trotskyism, doesn't it? At the end of the day, Western Marxism is steeped in Trotskyism, even that which claims to not be Trotskyist. This enables Balibar to contrast the nihilistic tendencies of revolutionary counter-violence to anti-violence, quote unquote, which denotes resistance to the reactive violence that violence itself elicits when it is generalized. Thus, the anti-violence of civility allows a mass movement to take a distance from itself, to engage in self-critique. There always has to be a space where people can reflect on the consequences and the after effects of their own social movements when they confront a violent social order or a legal state of injustice. In other words, civility is a second order reflection that prevents mass movements from falling prey to unthinking barbarity. It is the practice that pits careful reflections against the uninformed action. As Balibar notes, we must take risks and know which risks to take. And I just want to remind you, by the way, the reason I say what I say is because let us remember that Stalin represents the anti-colonial violent barbarity, and Trotsky represented the Western civilized socialism, the non-authoritarian kind. He literally said that all the time. My objection is that the notion of civility ontologizes politics by tying it to the ultra-political instances of contingency or groundlessness. This is evident when Balibar says that whenever a progressive movement has succeeded in its objectives, quote, this has never happened in accordance with the logic of such politics alone. Rather, another politics, irreducible to any of these received political concepts, has always led to the intervene in action or to provide politics with its underside, as it were. Precisely the politics that I am hypothetically calling civility. We're still just reading Balibar throughout this entire chapter. By the way, we got 1 minute to ads, comrades. If you like what you see here, think about supporting our stream. Direct donations to the Ko-Fi, to my PayPal, gift subs, biddies, all of that. Keep the stream going. We're a certain number of subs away from Happy Fun Time unlock. Even if we admit that politics is groundless, this doesn't necessitate the transformation of this groundlessness into an impolitic limit of politics. On the contrary, the contingent nature of politics testifies to the fact that the effects of violence can't be moderated by the reflective faculty of enlightened intellect. When Balibar asked political militants to take risks while knowing which risks they are taking, he elides the collective character of politics, wherein decisions are outside the remit of knowledge. Knowledge presupposes a relation or correspondence between the knower and the object is to be known. In politics, the risks that are to be known are outside of one's grasp, since their effects come into display only when they join the general field of social reality. Unless we take risks, we are never going to know their precise character. Balibar knows that politics is aleatory, that it cannot be provided with a permanent foundation, but he turns this very fact of contingency into a guiding principle that can be implemented by people when they undertake politics. This accords to a transcendental authority to the power of abstract reflection, which swoops in from afar to judge if a specific political action is respecting the contingency of politics. In concrete cases, this leads to a vague democratic ideology that repeats anti-communist and pro-imperialist falsities. Yo, thank you so much. DJ Mule, welcome in. I hope you're not all raiding into raiding into an ad right now, but you might be. No ad. Okay, good. Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much, DJ Mule, for that raid. I hope we're all doing great. I'm just reading everybody a little bit of base theory here. You're in an ad. You'll soon be out of the ad. Someone give DJ Mule. Look, DJ Mule just did us a solid, raided into us. Surely there must be some generous chatter in here who would donate my dear comrade DJ Mule a gift sub.
It's all for one motherfucker and one motherfucker.
Thank you, Song of Ashley. Appreciate that so much. Now, not only does DJ Mule not have to watch the ads anymore, DJ Mule can now get out of ad hell. Also, he has the wonderful Leaping Larry emotes now. Let's go. Welcome in. Thank you so much, comrades. I appreciate that so much. I owed one around these parts. Oh, I appreciate that, Ashley. Your support means a ton, comrade. Thank you. I hope you're all doing well. What were y'all doing on the DJ Mule stream? Talking some based revolutionary politics, no doubt. That's what we're doing here. I talked a lot about the DSA earlier. Reformism and entryism. I talked a lot about that. And then we looked at Chairman Africa of the New African Black Panther Party, of Newark, who has been on the front lines in Delaney Hall for quite a long time. has done really inspiring work, like build a breakfast program, build an after-school learning program, a school transportation program. Love seeing that shit. So we were looking at all of that stuff today. You were celebrating your birthday, taking it easy, muling with DJ Mule, learning more about the U.S. losing the war with Iran. Let's go. We're gonna actually look at the Tanky Times news here after we're done reading. So we'll see some of that ourselves. The panel was Friday night for me, but it did go into Saturday morning for me because it went to like 2 a.m. or something. It was a good panel. I got to cut it out. We had a panel about reformism, single payer healthcare system, and the limitations of that, and why we have to think about what those limitations are in even being able to accomplish them in the U.S. I will put that on my YouTube later. You comrades are actually in at a great time. We're kind of in the middle of this work called, or I should say in the middle of this chapter of this book called The Sword and the Dollar here. Or Sword and the Dollar. The Sword and the Neck. My bad. Sorry, comrades. We're reading this book here called The Sword and the Neck. This is the reading of the Alaska flood. This push, Sword and the Dollar is a good one too, absolutely. This pushes back against all of the mainstream left narratives about Alaska flood, particularly by Slavoj Žižek and other motherfuckers like that. We're actually dealing right now with Balibar, who is another one of these Western Marxists, quote unquote, who again is in the spirit of Trotsky, let's say, in that they have a language of revolution, but they take the side of condemning Hamas and condemning colonial violence. And I was actually just explaining to Chad how, that actually goes back to Trotsky and Stalin, funnily enough. Like the modern basis of that disagreement, of that fight, was between Trotsky accusing Stalin of being, this Asiatic, quote unquote, I'm quoting Trotsky here, brute, savage, whatever, colonized Georgian who wouldn't be fit to lead the USSR, and that leadership would have to come from Western Russians, Western Greater Russians, because they were more civilized, right? They were able to lead in a more democratic manner rather than the authoritarian manner that Stalin ruled in. And this is the same ideological thread that we get today from a lot of people who are self-described democratic socialists who will conflate the violence of colonialism with the counter-violence, we're calling it, the counter-violence of revolutionary liberatory struggle. And that's what we're dealing with. So if you missed it, if you're just coming in, I do encourage you to stick around for what I'm about to read here. This looks like it's going to be very interesting. So, this part here, the ideology of bourgeois democracy. And this is important because this is what we're talking about. And actually what I will say with democratic socialists, and we'll go back and watch the video that we watched earlier. With democratic socialists, the thing that Marxist-Leninists critique about them, and it's not because we hate them, as I was explaining before. The reason why we tactically and strategically explain what we don't agree with about, let's say, the DSA strategy or democratic socialist strategy is not because we hate them. It's because we see them as our comrades. It's because we see them as fellow humans, you see. And what we recognize, which you see happening in the United States right now, is that, it doesn't matter if you say that, oh, you know what, we're against revolutionary violence in all forms. We decry revolutionary violence, and instead, we're going to work within the democratic structures in order to bring about the revolution peacefully. Right? And that's the ideological thread behind it. And what that ends up doing is essentially saying, well, there is something in the US bourgeois democracy to save. There is something in the Canadian bourgeois democracy to save, you know? But the problem with that is that Canadian bourgeois democracy and American bourgeois democracy inherently exists on settler colonial violence against the native people. The democracy that was set up in Canada or America, the laws, the systematic structures of that order exist to erase the native people, the melting pot, all of that, right? That's what that exists to do. Which is why you can't simply, if there was an influence of anti-colonial forces upon that democracy, then they would make it illegal, which you see happening, right? It doesn't matter if you're on that social democratic side. It doesn't even matter if the forces of revolution are strong enough to actually have a revolution. You can be a democratic socialist, and you can just have organized enough of a labor struggle to harm bourgeois profits, and they will come for you too. And that's what we're saying is the problem, right? And we see that happening in the US, right? They're targeting not just the Marxist-Leninists, are they? But it's very, very convenient for them to also target the DSA members. And when we critique DSA, when we're saying that this is what we don't agree with about the democratic socialist strategy, again, we're not saying that to split the left. We're saying that because we care a lot. And we have seen many past instances where democratic socialists were left disarmed and faced fascist violence. Perhaps you've heard of Rosa Luxemburg. Perhaps you've heard of Karl Liebknecht, right? They were like democratic socialists. They were social democrats. And they organized enough of a labor struggle that cut into the profits of capitalists enough that the fascist violence was brought against them too. Even though Germany did not have a really solid enough revolutionary movement to actually threaten the capitalist system, right? Like, it just didn't exist there. Not like it existed in Russia at the time. They just weren't close to that. They were mostly still enamored by like this illusion, this false consciousness towards bourgeois democracy, which again led to their downfall. And that's the thing that we're worried, and that's the thing that we see repeating, right? And that's why we're like, it's not a way to like attack the social democrats or democratic socialists. We're not attacking Hassan. We're just pointing out, look, they're going to come for you too. It don't matter if you're saying, fuck Trumpism, fuck the establishment Democrats. We're going to get the good Democrats in. They don't care if you cut into their profits deep enough. Even if you do it with false consciousness, they will come for you too. And they will come for you along with the communists. So that's my whole point. When we're critiquing a strategic or a tactical difference, it's because we love you. We love you, and it is required for and some people who have already run up against the limitations of working in that way will be convinced by what we're saying. And isn't that good? Don't you want to highlight that, right? Like, I don't ever tell people, oh, don't ever study or look into what democratic socialists are doing. I invite you, look into the democratic socialists, look into the history of USSR and these other movements and America as well, and decide for yourself. That's what we're saying. In order to provide a correct solution, you need to at least understand what the problem is. When I talk to SOCDEM progressives in real life, they, in my opinion, don't understand the scope of the problem and how much work is required to change it. Yes, exactly. Because they get by what this book is talking about, they still get lost in that Western Marxist how do I put it? That tendency of Western Marxists to believe that there is something to save about this democracy. As if this government or this state or this democracy, whatever you want to call it, is just this benign entity that stands above society and that we can get into and we can and then we can make it serve us. When Marxists understand, no, we have to build our own society. Could you please say my question about Marx? Okay, let me see. I think it's less about something to save among the oppressive structure and more about people to save, who this fascist government would love to execute in the street if we give them the excuse. Yeah, no, I understand that. And I understand that that is their intention, that they want to save people. Rosa Luxemburg wanted to save people, right? But what we're saying is, even though a lot of people in democratic socialist organizations might want to save a lot of people, they are going to run up against the limitations of the state, and they themselves, oh wait, the Marx one, okay. And they themselves, though, will get themselves in danger. You know, that's what kind of I'm saying. Okay, let me see what, sorry, I missed the Marx one. After blowing my mind on Korea last Friday, you mentioned you could also alleviate my ignorance on Marx. What day would be a good day for that? Let's say Friday. Let's say Friday, because frig off Friday. We'll do a special Shauna Marx education session on Friday if you come in and you remind me. And I'll tell you whatever you want to know about Marx. All right? All right, you come in Friday, you remind me of that. And then that's what we'll do Friday. We'll learn all about Marx. All right, with that long-winded introduction, with that long-winded rant, I guess, to welcome you and thank DJ Mule for coming in, I'm now going to read you this section. The ideology of bourgeois democracy. Yes, exactly, Scorcha. Exactly. DemSoc approach to capitalist states is based on the premise that all states are fundamentally interchangeable in some way. Exactly. Whereas Marxist-Leninists understand the state to be a organ of class rule, set up by one state aimed against another state, which means we can never capture the bourgeois state. We can only smash it and build our own state. Spicy Pretzel, thank you so much for the gift sub to Scorch a Flame. Appreciate that. This last part looks like it's going to be really good. Oh my god. This looks like it's going to be good. Okay, so I'm just going to let you know when I'm reading this part here, we're going to be quoting a lot of this reactionary Balibar here. Okay, so here we go. The ideology of bourgeois democracy. The ontology of politics is visible in Balibar's comments on the Russia-Ukraine war.
To say that socialism doesn't work is to overlook the fact that it did work, and it worked for hundreds of millions of people.
Here we go. This is gonna hurt to read this shit. Oh boy. Balibar says, that the rationale behind the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine was twofold. Quote, first, Russia wanted to rebuild the empire that had been formed over centuries under the Tsarist regime and sanctified by the messianic mission of Holy Russia, then secularized and expanded by Stalin under the name of communism, now resurrected with the help of virulent nationalist ideology that counterposes its idealized traditional Greater Russia or Eurasia to the degenerate democratic West. That's from Balibar. Violence of Civil and Civility. On the Limits of Political Anthropology. Differences. Oh, God. Okay, I'm just wondering where my chats are right now, so I'm going to ask you all. Chat. Comrades in chat. What is the Ukraine-Russia war? Who can answer that? What is the cause? What is the cause of the Ukraine-Russia war? Does anybody know this? The 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. What caused that? NATO. Okay. Good. Good. Ukrainian Nazis. Also a good answer. Yes. Exactly. Okay. That's good. So the chat I'm assuming most of the chat in here understands then that the Ukrainian war did not start in 2022. I'm guessing by these responses that my comrades understand that the Ukrainian war started in 2014 with the overthrow of its government and the beginning of an ethnic cleansing campaign by Ukrainian fascists. Capitalist states fighting each other. No, it's not quite that simple. It's not quite that simple. That's kind of the narrative that Western Marxists like to say, is that, oh, it's just two big capitalist states fighting each other. But no, actually, in this instance as well, there is one country that is fighting an existential threat to its existence, and there's another country that is not. And the country that is fighting the existential threat to its existence is Russia. Russia is the country that NATO exists to exterminate. NATO was created for the sole purpose and continued for the sole purpose of destroying Russia. So that's the first thing you have to understand. You have to understand that Russia is their long-term goal to balkanize Russia. Yes, absolutely. They want to break Russia up into as many little bourgeois banana republics that they can. Because in that way, they can have it be an extraction colony in much the same way Ukraine is right now. You have to understand that, like, this is not just a zero-sum game, and that indeed there was ethnic cleansing in Ukraine, and that ethnic cleansing started in 2014 with the installation of a fascist government by the United States. I'll remind you, actually, by the way, Lindsey Graham went there in 2016 to Ukraine. That's before this Russian invasion, okay? And Lindsey Graham encouraged these Ukrainian fascists that they should go on the offensive and attack Donbass. And this, by the way, was after Ukraine agreed to Minsk Accords, which said that they agreed to a ceasefire with these forces in Donbass. So what always gets ignored when we're talking about Russia is the fact that people in Donbass, Russian speaking or not, were being hit by shells of Ukrainian fascists who were accusing everybody in that region of being Russian separatists. But they weren't Russian separatists, they're just Russian speaking Ukrainians. So again, we have to understand that then in 2022, or just before that, Donbass declared independence. Two separate republics declared independence. And it was them who asked Putin to come in and help them. This is why DPRK also saw it as a justified fight, not just against Ukrainian fascists, but a fight against US imperialism as well. And that's why DPRK, North Korea, went in and aided in the Kursk region. And they were justified in doing so as an anti-imperialist struggle. This is the thing that makes me kind of like unpopular, I guess, with my comrades on the West, is that I'm willing to say, indeed, the Russian special military operation has an anti-fascist character to it. An anti-fascist, anti-imperialist character to it. And Russia, since before 2022, has been willing to settle this with negotiations. The problem isn't the Russian side. The problem is once the other side does not want to enter into negotiations. There's a reason why Ukraine constantly goes on about a ceasefire. Do we not understand by now? With Israel and Palestine and Lebanon, do we not understand now what a ceasefire fucking means? Doesn't it? Can you not understand why Russia would not care about a fucking ceasefire? Because what a ceasefire means is a chance for us to stop, for us to get those very, very expensive weapons back in stock, and then to fight you some more. That's what that means. When the upper hand tends to be on the anti-colonial, the anti-imperialist forces, because they don't go for just bourgeois style of military development. And even though Russia is a capitalist state, its military actually has done active work to avoid falling into that pitfall of just making fucking weapons for the sake of profitability, so that it's super, super expensive, but not all that useful in war. Russia has actually avoided that because it has felt like it has always been like in this existential threat by US imperialism, right? So it has taken measures to avoid that problem. Russia, in my opinion, and this isn't because of Putin or anything, but Putin represents this trend in their society. I think Russia, as it struggles more and more for real independence, is inherently moving towards the East, is inherently moving economically and politically towards a more China-like model. And that can happen in a different way than it does in the West because there's a historical memory there that doesn't exist in the West. So the other thing I'll say is, we should also be very careful to be extremely rigid about Russia is capitalist. Like, Russia is capitalist, yes, but it's not moving towards a higher development of capitalism where it's going to become imperialism. Right? That's not the trend of its development, and we have to understand that. It's not like monopolizing the world's production and then exporting finance capital. That's not the direction it is developing in. If that changes, we'll update our analysis, but that's just not the direction it's heading in. And the direction that it has been moving in for quite a long time now has been actually strengthening not only liberation forces, not only resistance forces, but literal socialist forces as well. In at least as much as it did when it was the USSR under Khrushchev and Gorbachev or whoever else. And I'm not even joking. I'm not being cute. It does as much to aid in anti-resistance, like anti-imperialist resistance struggles in Africa, wherever, in a very measurable and vital way. That if that were to disappear tomorrow, it would be actually a serious detriment to the struggle against imperialism. So yeah, anyway, just a little note there, since we're talking about this. He never explains. I will now continue reading. Oh, absolutely, Branson. But remember, that's the result of like these swindlers and these compradors allowing it to be undermined, right? And like, it's very hard to rebuild that under a still capitalist system. However, the more it struggles against imperialism, the more Russia itself weakens imperialism, the more it also undermines its own capitalist system. Because it strengthens labor forces, right? The more that contradiction of imperialism is dealt with, the more the labor forces in Russia can deal with internal contradictions. Which is the only way you can build a revolution. An egg cracked from the inside can be new life. An egg cracked from the outside is just a meal. Okay, I'll continue the read now. He never explains why Stalin's rule represented a form of imperialism. He merely mentions the Holodomor, the 1932-33 famine that killed Ukrainian peasants. Balibar regards the Holodomor as the part of the greatest genocides of the 20th century, quote unquote. Oh my fuck. Putting it on par with the Holocaust. Oh my god, he's a double genocide theorist. Of course he is. Of course Balibar is. This interpretation takes part in an anti-communist model that attributes the Ukrainian famine to the evil intentions of Stalin. And that is 53. For more information on the anti-communist narrative surrounding the 1932-1933 famine, see For a Few Canards More, Counter-Inquiry on Stalin and the Soviet Union, Amrik Monvel, 2024 Iskra Books. See also Hiroki Kirimari, who provides much needed international geopolitical context, and noting that one might argue that in such a tense international environment, marked by Japan's invasion of Manchuria and the threat to the Soviet Far East, Polish-Japanese intelligence cooperation uprisings in Xinjiang and Mongolia, and fears of a two-front war involving Poland and Japan, Stalin would not have intentionally caused a large-scale famine, which would politically destabilize the country. Hiroki Kirimari, The Soviet Famine of 1932-1933 Reconsidered. Europe Asia Studies 60, number 4 from 2008. According to Mark B. Trauger, the famine was not limited to Ukraine, but affected virtually the entire Soviet Union, and resulted, first of all, from a series of natural disasters in 1931-1932 that diminished harvests drastically. It is illogical to say that Stalin killed Ukrainian peasants because the Soviet regime depended for its survival on the peasantry and relied on the peasants to overcome the famine, which they did by producing a much larger harvest in 1933, despite the tragic famine conditions in which they worked. This showed that collectivization allowed the mobilization and distribution of resources, like tractors, seed aid, and food relief, to enable farmers to produce a large harvest during a serious famine, which was unprecedented in Russian history, and almost so in Soviet history. So, in other words, Stalin's policies, by the way, which we are constantly told made the famine worse, did the opposite. It was Stalin's policies that mitigated the famine to a degree which had never before been seen in Russian history. Making it, by the way, one of the last famines in a series, a cycle of tragic famines that plagued Eastern Europe for fucking millennia. It was Stalin's policies, Stalin's collectivization of agriculture, mobilization of those resources, etc., that ended the cycle of famine, even amongst those natural disasters. While a war was looming. That is what we have to understand. Stalin didn't cause the famine. The policies that the USSR passed under Stalin ended the cycle of famines once and for all. Anyway, to continue. It is also important to remember that it was farm collectivization that strengthened the Soviet state against the Nazi army by ensuring the priority of Red Army soldiers and war workers over peasants in the wartime allocation of food. Without the defeat of Germany by the Soviets, Hitler would have achieved domination over continental Europe, possibly leading to Britain's withdrawal from the conflict and hindering American support to Europe. Thus, when we look beyond the decontextualized invocation of famine, we can observe how the Soviet Union preempted the spread of fascism, and then brought about large-scale, revolutionizing changes in Ukrainian society. It turned a largely agricultural and illiterate country into a highly industrialized nation in the developed world. For instance, the first computer in USSR was developed in Kiev. With Soviet collapse, Ukraine's industry suffered greatly due to open theft and deterioration. Ukraine could not find any market for its industrial goods after the destruction of the Soviet trade links. The absence of concrete analyses is also present in the equivalence that Balibar makes between the Holodomor and the Holocaust. Jacqueline Coulson notes that the Holodomor has functioned as a nationalist narrative in the building of Ukraine, mobilizing hatred not only against Russians, who are constructed as foreign, invasive other, but also against Jews. In wartime Soviet Ukraine, Nazi occupiers used public accounts of the famine to stoke anti-Semitic sentiments, blaming the Jews for committing genocide against Ukrainians. Since its establishment in 1929, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationals, OUN, framed Judeo-Bolshevism, quote-unquote, as a powerful threat to Ukrainian nationalism, thus carrying out violent acts against Ukrainian Jews. This anti-Semitic worldview led to the belief that Jews had somehow caused, benefited from, or escaped the famine. Levko Lukyanenko, author of the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, thought that the Jews were in control of the Soviet government when the supposed genocide took place. Weird how it's just Nazi shit. Huh? Isn't that weird how anti-Stalinism ends up always just being Nazi shit? Wonder why that is. Wonder if we could look into that at some point. Yet this projection of Jewish culpability during the famine is not simply a matter of historical confusion. It has been part of a longer, ideologically motivated structure of erasure that has sought to overwrite Ukraine's deep involvement in the Holocaust. As Taylor Donavis observes, the explicit use of genocide in narratives around the Holodomor often works to obscure the fact, here we go, that Ukrainian forces, particularly the Nazi-established Ukrainian Auxiliary Police, were central actors in the extermination of Jews during the Holocaust. These indigenous police forces were not marginal collaborators, but were directly involved in registering Jews, conducting raids, guarding ghettos, and executing civilians, including Jewish children. Veterans of the OUN took the lead in organizing pogroms as early as June 1941. By the end of that year, tens of thousands of Jews had been murdered with Ukrainian complicity. Despite this, the Ukrainian state has not openly reckoned with these histories. Sites such as Byamyan Yar have instead been repurposed to promote a nationalist narrative of Ukrainian victimhood. As Genovese notes, the signage at Byamyan Yar Memorial centers the sufferings of Ukrainians, Jews, Romani under the Hitlerite regime, placing Ukrainians first and the implicity equating their suffering with that of ethnic minorities who were systematically exterminated. This rhetorical displacement resembles what Genovese calls the darkly apophatic move, a maneuver that obscures historical collaboration by decentering Jewish victimhood in favor of a homogenized and depoliticized human tragedy. By not undertaking a historically grounded dissection of the Ukrainian famine, and by abstractly equating it with the Holocaust, Balibar partakes in a politics. Drugs! I choose drugs! I'm almost done this book, and then I'll choose drugs. By not undertaking a historically grounded dissection of the Ukrainian famine, and by abstractly equating it with the Holocaust, Balibar partakes in the politics of competitive atrocity, wherein suffering is inflated as a unique, immoral event, instead of being referred to its socio-structural contents. Where still, such equivalences risk providing discursive cover for far-right nationalist projects that seek to exonerate Ukrainians' fascist past, while simultaneously positioning it as a perennial victim of totalitarian violence. Balibar says that the imperial ambitions of Russia are being reinvented through the dichotomy of traditionalist Greater Russia, or Eurasia, and a degenerate democratic West. This is a purely culturalist analysis that overlooks the actuality of geoeconomic politics. A Eurasian project is not about traditionalist and imperialist ideology, but about the reduction of European countries' dependence on the US-led unipolar world through trade with Russia and China. Amazing. Right there. It overlooks the actual geopolitical strategy of reducing dependence on US imperialism. I had assumed the Ukrainian Nazi thing was Putin propaganda. Oh no. No. Not at all. Quite the opposite. Again, I've pointed out before, like, for all the problems and limitations that might exist, in many ways, the biggest opposition to Putin is not the people. It's not, and this is a relation that I know is hard to grasp in the US, but the reason why he has such popular support is because the political realm that he occupies, the politics that his party puts forward, represents a struggle against Western imperialism and the particular ideological consciousness and demands of a great number of people. And much of Putin's opposition is actually in the bourgeoisie, who want to get closer and be more of a comprador to the US. Whereas he, in the beginning, wanted to be partners with the US. And when he realized the impossibility of this, his politics shifted to be more aligned with the people. And that is essentially, like, that's been the political realm he's in ever since. It's not a great man theory that's explaining he's so popular because his politics shifted to reflect a particular demand of the people. Okay? And that's why Putin is so popular. That's why he keeps getting elected. It's not just him rigging elections. That's fucking bullshit by the West. He's so popular because he quickly realized he would not be a partner, and those politics of the party, the particular political group he occupies, reflected that, recognizing of that lesson. And therefore has a legitimate fight against US imperialism that causes mass support. It's honestly not that hard to grasp. Due to the war in Ukraine, Europe has reduced its use of Russian gas, thereby increasing dependence on costlier US liquefied natural gas, LNG. The US has exploited this energy crisis by selling its LNG to Europe at high prices. This allows the US to exercise greater influence on European foreign policy. What Balibar characterizes as the traditionalism of present-day Russia is not the core component of the country's reigning politics. Rather, Russia pragmatically operates according to multiple ideologies that can challenge the legitimacy of US-led world order, and thus help combat imperialist attacks against Russia. Bang on. Right on the money. This is a fucking good book. Yo, no, I want you all to think about that for a second, right? And I want you think about how that's every anti-Russian friend of ours on the left. You have that narrative. They have this exact phrasing about Russia being traditionalism, right? Does Putin not have troubling crossovers with Christian nationalism like anti-LGBTQ? No, I mean, look, he himself might have problematic fucking takes. No one is doubting that. But to characterize Russia as being more inherently anti-LGBTQ than the West because it's traditionalist is exactly playing into these politics that isn't true. There's multiple overlapping ideologies. There's multiple competing struggles that are happening. And I would say that, like, for the vast majority of trans people, it's materially fucking worse in the US, where you have a stoking of fucking actual LGBTQ violence. Russia is more anti-LGBTQ, though. It's not. I don't know why we carry water for Russia. Because again, we support anything that weakens US imperialism. Imperialism doesn't discriminate. You saying that the US is less anti-LGBTQ is ridiculous. The West provides Israel with the bombs to bomb LGBTQ Palestinians. How is that less anti-LGBTQ? Russia's not fucking bombing LGBTQ people in a fucking bunch of other countries. That's ridiculous. This is what we're saying. You're engaging in a moralist position. Russia is bombing Ukraine. Who is the aggressor in the Ukraine conflict? Who is the aggressor? Sergeant? No. How could that be the case? How can Russia be an aggressor in a conflict that started before there was any Russian involvement? What do you mean, LOL, okay? Ukraine was bombing people in Donbass in 2014, before the Russian invasion. So, again, explain to me how Russia can be the aggressor in that situation, when it was Ukrainian citizens being bombed by their own state. I mean, yeah. Is Donbass part of Russia? That has nothing to do with what I just said. No, but it don't matter. It don't matter if it is or not. What does that have to do with what I just said? Let's recognize it as part of Ukraine. Does that give Ukraine the right to bomb its own people? I don't understand your fucking logic in that question. What's the point of asking me if Donbass is Russia? Was it so if you recognize that Donbass is part of Ukraine, then why was it okay for Ukraine to shell its own people before there was a Russian invasion? If the answer to that is no, then interventionism is wrong by you. I mean, no. You're listening to you're not answering my question. I want you to actually answer my question, please. Is it wrong for me to say that the US is the aggressor too? Absolutely not. The US overthrew their... Okay, you just said Russia because you asked me if Donbass is Russian territory. Fine. If we're recognizing Donbass is not Russian territory, then how can Russia be the aggressor when Ukraine shelled its own people? How can you say that Russia is the aggressor? So you're saying that it's okay for a country to shell its own people. You're saying that it's okay that Ukrainian was shelling Russian-speaking people. Right? Seems to be what your implication. Since it's not Russian territory, then I guess it was justified, right? For Ukraine to shell people there, anti-Russian speakers, and accuse them of being Russian separatists, then. Don't worry, chat. The hold is just to prevent any dogpiling. I'm just trying to understand this. Like, what the logic is here. Could you give me a bullet point list of Ukraine and Russian military hostilities for perspective on the history before the conflict? I mean, you think it's either or, and it's not. Two things can be true at once. Russia is the aggressor, and B, Ukraine should not be shelling its own people. See? No. So you give no agency to the people in Donbass. You think that the people in Donbass who are being shelled should not be able to do anything about it, is what you're saying. Right? Both things are bad. Therefore, the people of Donbass should not have organized to fight back or ask Russia to intervene. That's what you're saying. They should have just lied down and allowed themselves to be bombed. You're literally... What's funny is you're Balibar. Balibar? Is that you? Etienne Balibar? Do we have a celebrity right here in my chat? Because you're literally doing that both sides shit. One side is clearly a victim. Interventionalism is okay with you. It's not interventionalism. There's no interventionalism that happened. Donbass declared independence from Ukraine. After Ukraine violated the Minsk resolutions. People in Donbass were left with no other option. Continue to be just bombed endlessly by a much more powerful military, or ask for help to stop themselves from dying. You're saying that intervention is wrong, therefore the people of Donbass should have just died. That's a nonsense argument. What I say is, listen to what the people in fucking Donbass wanted, which was to live in peace. When they couldn't get that, they asked for independence, and when independence wasn't recognized and they were still shelled, they asked for help. That doesn't make Russia the aggressor. No. The aggressor is US imperialism that overthrew the USSR. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. Russia-Ukraine conflict didn't begin in 2022. It began in the 50s. It began with the overthrow of the USSR in 1991. We're not living in the past. We understand that the past has reverberations into the future. Things that happen in the past have a reflection in the present. We don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in a static world. Things that have happened in 1950s have a reflection on things that then happened in 1990, which then have a reflection on what happened here. Oh my God. You're just such a little fucking... Yeah, cry some more. You're fucking pathetic. Give me a fucking break. Oh, your multiple accounts that you're watching me on, huh? Well, thank you for giving me something to rant about and more content to cut, because I appreciate that. Thank you. Seriously. But now I just want to say real quick, right? I just want to say real quick. We can trace this really quickly. It's not that hard, right? So we think about what it was saying by this going back to 1950s. In 1950s, after Stalin died and the Trotskyites had taken the leadership, we have Khrushchev gifting the Donbass region to Ukraine. Can you maybe see how that would have been the start of everything we're seeing now, in a sense? Now, it wouldn't have been, right? It wouldn't have been if USSR had survived. It wouldn't have been if the United States didn't undermine and overthrow USSR. And the reason it wasn't a problem or wasn't a big deal then is because USSR, Ukraine, and the rest of Russia, and the rest of Russian peoples, and beyond were part of the same country, the part of the same unity. Right? They were the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Roy, good to see you. So during that time, it didn't matter. It really did not matter that there was a gifting of the Donbass region because they were all part of the same country. They could move freely between the Ukraine and other parts. Right? There was no problem then. It's only with the overthrow of 1991, with the stoking of anti-Russian sentiments used to overthrow and break up the USSR, that it then becomes a problem. Because what is used to break up USSR in the country, in the other republics, is literally anti-Russian sentiment, which has its foundations in the anti-Russian sentiment during fascism. So that's what we have to understand. And so there's a direct line between the gifting of Donbass to Ukraine and then the overthrow of USSR, and now those fascists being empowered continuously and constantly by the West, including an overthrow in 2014, which led to the acceleration of violence against Russian people, particularly in the Donbass region. And then Donbass breaking away, asking for Russian assistance. You see how that's able to then be framed as they're breaking out of that normative violence. They need to go back to the peace, you see. The peace that existed when people in Donbass were being shelled. I will do drugs. I just want to finish reading this part. Which is exactly what we're talking about in this reading here. Okay, everybody follow Virgo. I'm going to continue reading. Due to the war in Ukraine, Europe has reduced its use of Russian gas, thereby increasing its dependence on costlier US liquefied natural gas, LNG. The US has exploited this energy crisis by selling its LNG to Europe at higher prices. This allows the US to exercise greater influence on European foreign policy. What Balibar characterizes as the traditionalism of present-day Russia is not the core component of the country's reigning politics. Traditionalism has nothing to do with it, as I just explained. This is an entirely accurate statement Yanis Iqbal is about to make right here. Rather, Russian pragmatically operates according to multiple ideologies that challenge the legitimacy of US-led world order and thus help combat imperialist attacks against Russia. Western observers have accused Russia of being traditionalist because they overemphasize the conservative and authoritarian elements that compose Putinism. What they overlook is the fact that these ideologies are said to be against the excessive liberalism and globalism of the West. Thus, what matters for Putin is a sovereigntist position against the West. one that uses patriotism against an interventionist Western liberal order. The 2023 report, Russia's Policy Towards the World Majority, published by the most influential foreign policy institutes of Russia, argues that US unipolarity is being challenged by a new coalition that is not anti-West, but non-West. It is not ideologically hostile to the West, but finds itself opposed to the objective interests of the global North. This opposition manifests itself in support for the multipolar world order, where nation-states are free from imperialist influence, and thus more permeable to popular influence. As the report states, quote, "The extremist mutation of the liberal idea currently underway in the West should not be classified as a specific product of Western civilization, not subject to internationalization. There is a need for our response, agreeable with the cultural and philosophical traditions of different civilizations, to the most acute challenges to human development, ranging from environmental issues to ethical problems related to modern technologies. Blindly following the Western agenda is not just useless, but is also harmful." Where's the lot? The distinction between anti-West and non-Western is important because it highlights that Russia's illiberal and traditionalist biases are not reflective of imperial ambitions. Instead, they are a subordinate component of its sovereigntist position that supports multipolarization. Insofar as multipolarization will democratize the world order, it needs to be critically welcomed, even as we oppose the traditionalist streaks in Russian politics. Second, Balibar writes that the Russian invasion was a preventive political war aimed at crushing, quote, "the liberal democratic orientation of the Ukrainian state," so that it did not inspire reformist changes in Russia itself. He says that the Maidan Revolution of 2013-14 was a, quote, "democratic intervention." Despite all its weaknesses, like sectarianism, oligarchical manipulation, political corruption, and the involvement of militias, for Balibar, the ultimately democratic character of the Maidan Revolution lies in the fact that it initiated a collective move towards the official values of Western European democratic systems, however oligarchic they themselves can be, but leaving room for political pluralism. And it could represent a model for the citizens of the Russian Federation. From Balibar. So the democratic character of the Maidan Revolution lies in its espousal of bourgeois liberal democracy. It is hardly a foregone conclusion that the political pluralism of liberal democracy is superior to other regimes. Pluralist democracy can very well function as the most efficient means of authoritarianism. This is what happened in the Maidan Revolution. The 2014 Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, tried to play Russia and the European Union off of one another to get the best economic deal for Ukraine. Thus, he became the target of Western-backed business interests and Russia-phobic neo-Nazi groups. The slogans of dignity and alignment with the EU deployed during the Maidan protests were not embedded in a structural critique of inequality, labor precarity, or a global capitalist order. Rather, they gestured towards a civilizational reorientation that uncritically adopted EU and NATO as proxies for modernization and progress. Oh, how peaceful, comrades. How non-aggressive these moves are, right? Right? These moves aren't aggressive. This is all just peaceful democratic development of Western society, right? This desire for Western affiliation ignored the internal crises of the EU itself. At the very moment when protesters in Kiev were waving EU flags, demonstrators in Athens and Madrid, reeling from austerity imposed by that same EU, were burning them. Far from signaling solidarity with global struggles against capital, the Maidan movement embodied a nationalist aspiration clothed in the language of westernization. Far-right nationalist groups, such as Svoboda and Right Sector, though electorally marginal, held disproportionate influence on the ground. These forces were often the most militant in street classes and later found glorification in post-Maidan Ukraine as national heroes and commanders of parliamentary battalions. Their mainstreaming narrowed the space for leftist critique, entrenched a form of hyper-patriotic militarism, and helped institutionalize reactionary ideology in state structures. Given the civilizational nationalism that the Maidan movement espoused, it wasn't even surprising that its geographic spread was highly uneven. Despite its mythologization as a Kiev-based national revolt, only 13% of Maidan-related protests occurred in the capital.
Huh?
The majority were concentrated in the western and central regions of Ukraine, areas with stronger pro-European leanings. In contrast, the Russian-speaking East and South viewed the uprising with suspicion or outright hostility. These regional asymmetries reflected not just cultural divergences, but material interests. While Ukraine, reliant on labor exports, sought closer EU ties, the East was deeply integrated into industrial trade networks with Russia. Fears in the East of violence and linguistic and cultural exclusion were not Russian fabrications, but responses to real process of nationalist homogenization and Western modernization.
Whole way of thinking.
Apparently, some people think that those people in Donbass facing that nationalist violence should have just laid down, actually. With US backing, the NATO neo-Nazi axis staged a coup and forced Yanukovych to flee to Moscow. On February 6, 2014, an anonymous entity.
The revolution that feeds the children gets my support.
That's right, exactly. Here's an interesting detail, well known, well documented, but still people want to deny that the aggressor in this conflict was indeed NATO, the United States, using Ukraine as a proxy. On February 6, 2014, an anonymous entity leaked a call between U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pratt. They could be heard saying that Etienne Yatsenyuk is America's choice to replace Yanukovych, which he did. The new government adopted pro-EU and pro-NATO policies. It imposed restrictions on the teaching of Russian language in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, provoking resistance among the inhabitants. With the support of the majority of the population expressed in a referendum, Putin joined Crimea to Russia. In the same year as Russia's annexation of Crimea, separatist leaders, supported by Moscow, seized Donetsk and Luhansk, populated primarily by Russian ethnic minorities striving for independence, and declared the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk. These events angered ultra-nationalist Ukrainian forces. They declared war on the people that were opposing yet Yunski's Euro-American posture. Hey, we all have to start somewhere. It's not about where you were yesterday, comrades. It's about the direction you're heading. Those people who are generally seeking truth are all welcome here. Like I say, don't matter where you were yesterday. If you're searching for truth, you're in the right place, and I'm here to do what I can to help you. You know, if that means that I sometimes respond to trolls and fascists, then fine. That's fine, because that gives me content that other people who are listening along can use too. So you might think you're trolling me. Whoever's lurking out there. You may think you're trolling me with little questions about Ukraine that you think are going to get me in a gotcha, but I actually welcome it, and I like it, because that allows me to show other people how to respond to people like this. That gives other people examples. I've done this for 20 years, right? I've done this for 20 years, responding to questions and comments and defending DPRK, defending all of these places. So I hope that when somebody responds like a troll like that, you see the way I respond to them, and you can use that towards your own responses, okay? There's a reason I respond as if I'm always responding to their content. Because even if I know they're trolling, perhaps something I say in response will reach somebody that's listening along the sidelines that might have wanted to ask a similar thing but didn't. So I always do that. And I always repeat myself without hesitation. So thank you. Thank you for helping me teach chat, those of you who think you're trolling me. And to continue. So, far from being an instance of democratic intervention, the Maidan Revolution was a maneuver through which Northern imperialist forces staged a coup, promoted neo-Nazi forces in the state apparatus, and launched a war against Russian ethnic minorities in the country. This liquidated the sovereignty of Ukraine and plunged it into a simulated semi-colonial situation without being directly occupied and divided, but nevertheless reprogrammed to launch a war against itself and to point offensive weapons at neighboring Russia. Instead of initiating a democratic resurgence, liberal democracy functioned as the framework for a NATO neo-Nazi axis that wanted to wage war against Russia without any concerns for the human cost. However, Balibar ignores all of this by merely asserting that, quote, there is complete dissymmetry for a democratic country between the perspectives of being taken and swallowed again by a backward-looking autocratic empire. Think about that chatter we just had. Think about that chatter we just had, and you'll see why I call them Balibar. And the perspectives of being incorporated into a federation which creates or perpetrates inequalities, but has set up rules for negotiating participation. Unquote. In the end, we get an Orientalist assertion that replaces a concrete examination of the Russian social formation with an unverified faith in the goodness of bourgeois Western democracy. Oh, but you see, both are bad. Well, you see, when you take the position of both are bad, you're actually standing in the camp of the status quo. You cannot help but do otherwise, because there is no third road. There is two roads. The anti-imperialist road and the pro-imperialist road. There's nothing in between that. Given that Balibar's politics of civility forgoes the confrontation of social forces in favor of a reflective power of bourgeois democracy, it is no surprise that his discussion of the global significance of the Palestinian movement is oriented towards the abstract goal of justice. He says that both Ukraine and Palestine are united in the pursuit of justice. What? Who else has heard that? Who else has heard that? If any if any place is like Israel in this current condition, it is Ukraine. Which, by the way, its leaders explicitly said, I want to be a big Israel. Hey, I'm just quoting. Quote. Now I'm going to quote another dick. Balibar. Quote, Balibar. Not only the justice that refers to a position in war, on one side or the other of the divide between aggressor and victim, or oppressor and resistant, but the justice that can acquire a universal resonance, the justice that confers a universalistic dimension upon the claims of right that some actors embody in the war. Both Ukraine and Palestine, quote, appear as incarnations of universal principles of self-determination and resistance to oppression, thus being the reason why, in different parts of the world, there are today activists who make valuable efforts to simultaneously support and articulate the two causes. Oh, God. Here we go. Here we go. My favorite word coming up next. Yeah, I mean, that's an apt comparison too, Mushroom. The universalist perspective of justice is different from the logic of campism, which sees the current conflagrations either in terms of a conflict between democracies and totalitarian states, or a conflict between Western imperialism, under US hegemony organized by NATO, and the emerging peoples, with a tricontinental basis. Balibar wants to repudiate both of these camps. Both of these campus perspectives by emphasizing the specific history of each war, each people, each territory in its own local terms. And by describing the modalities in which the war has developed out of conditions and choices that were made by their own actors, Russians, Ukrainians, Israeli Jews, and Palestinian Arabs, with all their internal divisions and their complete histories. At first glance, this appears to be a call for historical specificity. Yet, what Balibar offers is not concrete history, but a form of historicist normalization that denies the actuality of imperialist totality by treating each conflict as sui generis, unlinked from any shared historical logic. In the name of the local, he evacuates the global. What is displaced in this move is the material structure of the imperialist camps, as real determinations that shape the possibility and form of local struggles. The local is not ontologically prior to imperialism, but is precisely that which is articulated through it. This is the paradox of nominalist historicism. While it presents itself as a rejection of abstraction in favor of the particular, it can only sustain itself by positioning an abstract essence of the local, a pure, self-determining locality, uncontaminated by global relations of force. Thus, in its disavowal of imperialist structuralization, nominalization inevitably leads back to the very abstraction it seeks to avoid. It must appeal to transcendent ideals of justice, liberty, self-determination. It is the organizing ground of meaning, because it has emptied the local of its material embeddedness in global antagonisms. The critique of campism, then, ends up reinscribing liberal universalism under the guise of radical historicity. Trump is not at all chummy with Putin. Trump was only chummy with Putin because he thought doing so would convince Putin to break away from China. When that didn't happen, the whole time he was doing so, he was giving Ukraine all the means, including the long-arm data, through which to strike Russia. So he might have been doing this rhetorical game with Putin, but Putin could see the entire time that he was also giving Ukraine the long-range targeting data required for it to strike positions in Russia. So they could see the glaring contradiction right before their eyes. It was just simply a strategy of trying to dangle a carrot in front of a stick, much like what Trump tried to do to North Korea before that. The American empire controls, through NATO and other modalities, 74.3% of all military spending worldwide. Can I reiterate and point out here again how NATO and the US are the aggressors? Russia is facing an existential threat to its existence in the form of NATO. The American empire controls, through NATO and other modalities, 74.3% of all military spending worldwide. This amounts to more than 2 trillion US dollars. Thus, quote, the single most important aspect of state power, that is, military power, the absolute central danger to the working class of all countries, especially to the darker nations of the world, lies in the US imperialist camp. The struggles for justice and liberty that Balibar imagines obscure the contradiction between the imperialism of the American empire and the people of the global south. He says that this division, while remaining real and crucial, is also compounded by other global phenomena, namely global warming and environmental catastrophe, which subvert all borders of the world. But ecological degradation itself is differently distributed according to the socio-economic gradations of the world imperialist system. Countries of the global south are disproportionately affected by climate change due to the fact that climate warming hits the hotter, low altitude, tropical, and subtropical regions of the earth especially hard. These countries are also generally poor due to imperialist factors, such as underdevelopment, maldevelopment, poverty, corruption, and inequality, which amplify each extreme weather event into social tragedies as communities suffer displacement, hunger, and heightened precarity. Balibar sees contemporary conflicts not as a division between camps, but as a globalized hybrid war. This hybrid war supposedly subverts the boundary of those camps by unleashing a quest for justice and liberty that is not reducible to geopolitical and military conflicts. We can see here how the politics of civility ends up with an abstract, contemplative mindset that wants to attain justice, not through the struggle of camps, but through another ethereal struggle that floats above all concrete divisions. In the end, this ethereal level of justice becomes synonymous with the defense of bourgeois democracy, since it contains the appearance of pluralism. Civility becomes a pro-imperialist prejudice that constantly rails against the hordes of uncivil masses who are not trained in the kind of reflection that bourgeois democracy teaches. In the real world, by contrast, conflicts are resolved not through careful contemplation, but through uncivil antagonisms. I love that this is perfectly in line with their discussion about reformism and entryism earlier. It's amazing how much this book, I swear I didn't plan that. That just happened. But you see You see how that anti-Russian position that we see literally leads people into that dead end, into that seeing. And by the this is why, comrades, I uncritically say it's not this complex fucking thing at the end of the day. I mean, it is a complex struggle, but it's not complex in that we can say very openly, very accurately, that in the struggle for liberation of humanity from imperialism, Russia is a progressive country, while the West is the opposite. It's a reactionary country. Despite that appearance of pluralism that every friend of ours on the left wants to celebrate as being some theoretical democracy or democracy that once existed. Despite that democracy exists to keep safe a colonial violence, a perpetrating colonial violence. And that's why those fighting against that are actually in the progressive camp, including, yes, Russia. That one in chat if that makes sense to you. And it's okay if it doesn't. I ask you to keep tuning in, and hopefully one stream will start to. Today, the most important division is between imperialism and humanity. You have to ask yourself what camp you're in. What camp is who in? What camp is the West in between imperialism and humanity? What camp is Russia in? I mean, it's not a matter of what Putin does. It's a matter of what Russia does. But Putin, as the leader of Russia, fighting against US imperialism is inherently a progressive struggle. Tactically, strategically, a progressive struggle. Today, the most important division is between imperialism and humanity. The Palestinian cause cannot be separated from the struggle against US domination. A fact that is well understood by the axis of resistance: Iran, Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq. Popular democracy can be realized only through strengthened national sovereignty that is capable of waging defensive wars against USA's policy of sanctions, invasions, encroachments, and destabilizations. Yes, even when that war is decried as being the aggressive one by the West, such as in the case of Russia. As Etienne writes, wars of national sovereignty against imperialism are pro-working class. The contemporary axis plays a limited but real liberatory role in staving off state collapse in the countries near and around Palestine, and shielding populations' social reproduction and popular well-being against the reaper accumulation through development. The same logic of anti-imperialism applies to Russia. The country witnessed more than 25 million deaths due to the invasion of European fascists when it was governed by communists. Today, Russia is again a target of imperialist forces. The US NATO camp wants to permanently destroy Russia's nuclear military capacity and install a puppet regime in Moscow in order to dismember Russia in the long term and replace it with many smaller, permanently weakened vassal states of the West. Thus, we have a campus struggle that no one can escape. Any new horizon has to be born from within these camps, amidst the uncontrollable, contingent materiality of struggles. So you can deny the camps all you want, but you will still be standing in a camp. One of two. Revolutionary movement, the last part. The present-day Palestinian movement is giving us indications of what an alternate revolutionary politics can look like by erecting a sharp divide between the democratic ideology of bourgeois intellectuals and the militancy of the masses. On the one hand, intellectuals like Balibar are worried that Hamas is reproducing the violent mentality of Zionism. This is based on the assumption that the October 7th attack was an irrational outburst of primitive sentiments without any political rationale. That is why politics can only be entrusted to this reflective scrutiny of democratic discussions. In Balibar's theory, such reflective scrutiny is provided by civility, which is a form of politics that can touch the ultra-political contingency of politics itself. This ultra-political contingency is an inconvertible violence that forms the limit point of every political action. If we hubristically suppose that all violence can be converted into reason, we will end up with the fantasy of omnipotence, in which all resistance is eliminated in a cycle of nihilistic violence. That is why Balibar's politics of civility wants us to respect the contingency of politics without attempting to hide it beneath fantasies of omnipotence. Thus, even though politics is tragic, groundless, and without guarantees, this, quote, tragedy of politics can become a politics of tragedy on the basis of the ethical decision that the risk of the pervasion of the revolt is not sufficient reason not to revolt. From Balibar, Violence of Civility. In the paradigm of civility, people will revolt with the full knowledge that they are intrinsically impotent and can't wholly eliminate antagonism. Thus, we get a politics of tragedy, sustained by an ethical reflection upon the groundlessness of politics. On the other hand, we have the mass action of Palestinian anti-colonialism, wherein the dilemma of politics are answered not through the philosophical invocation of ultra-political contingency, but through the confrontation of forces on the terrain of social reality. Balibar simplifies divisions by dissolving them into a transcendental level of civility, wherein the political actor can treat antagonisms in a peaceful manner, instead of trying to eliminate the enemy. The enlightened political actor focuses on how antagonisms can never be entirely eliminated, or how politics can never attain full stability. This knowledge curbs violence against the enemy and cultivates a more civil attitude. One cannot fail to emphasize how Palestinians are constantly asked to demonstrate their civility. Their language has to remain perpetually aware of the kind of effects that it may have on others. This leads to a hyper-moderation of Palestinian behavior, where anything that is disliked by Israeli oppressors is deemed anti-Semitic. And I don't even like. I'm gonna say I don't even. A lot of bad empanadas takes tick me the fuck off, especially his anti-Stalin bullshit. But I will say the attacks towards a lot of that camp that happened very much reflected exactly this right here. Where anybody who spoke out too much or used language that was deemed uncomfortable for Israeli occupiers was decried as being anti-Semitic language or re-co-opting of fascist language or some other such shit like this. Muhammad al-Kurd writes, "We were instructed to ignore the Star of David on the Israeli flag and to distinguish Jews from Zionists with surgical precision. It didn't matter that their boots were on our necks and that their bullets and batons bruised us. Our statelessness and homelessness were trivial. What mattered was how we spoke about our keepers, not the conditions they kept us under. Blockaded, surrounded by colonies and military outposts, or the fact that they kept us at all. Mohammed al-Kurd, Jewish settlers stole my house. It's not my fault they're Jewish. Mondowis, 26th of December, 2023. In this situation, simple ignorance becomes a luxury for Palestinians. If we keep focusing on how the oppressed should regulate themselves so that they don't fall into barbarity, we will forget that no matter how they behave, they will never be perfect enough for a dialogue with the oppressors. Balibar thinks that by being the perfect victims, the oppressed will convince the oppressors to negotiate their antagonisms with them in a thoughtful manner. But this is never going to happen. Antagonisms are irreconcilable as long as they are not fought out to their end. Al-Kurd rightfully asks us to renew our commitment to the truth, to spiriting the truth. Spitting is a physical expression of disgust or aggression. It is an open declaration of hostility instead of a solely cognitive exchange of knowledge. Cognition and reflection fail to initiate the flow of ideas, since the sea of thinking remains trapped in the spaces of colonialism. The bodily realities of the colonized and colonizing subjectivity. The flow of ideas will happen once their spatial encasements are burst open. Antagonisms have to jump, started through the act of spitting the truth, through violence against the colonialist, such as in Russia or Palestine. My editor's note, Larry's note. Balibar, in contrast, subscribes to a cognitive schema where he regards antagonisms as concrete representatives of an ultra-political antagonism, which he designates as the precariousness of politics that we have to constantly recognize. We only have concretely situated groups with concrete interests. These interests cannot be removed through careful reflection and discussion. On the contrary, they are material structures whose rigidity needs to be broken down through the concrete struggle of forces. This is what anti-colonial violence does, by eroding the sense of entitlement enjoyed by colonizers and espousing them to the popular power of the colonized. In the midst of struggle, only a detached philosopher can ask the oppressed to use violence in a way that preserves the openness of antagonisms. This openness or precariousness of politics is not an idea that can be theoretically pondered upon, or a reservoir of morality that can be used to practice civility. Rather, it is an emergent reality, formed through the destruction of the oppressors. That is why inconvertible violence as such does not exist. Sorry, Bug, I just told you to stop. That is why the inconvertible violence as such does not exist. Bugga, what the fuck? Are you kidding me? I just said stop it! Fucking make my head hurt with the way she chomps on that railing. God. The inconvertibility of violence is determined conjuncturally when political procedures of conversion encounter certain impasses, obstacles. Instead of staring at the impasse and turning into a philosophical principle of precariousness, we need to use the impasse to reconfigure our own political perspectives and carry on the struggle. The groundlessness of politics is not a tragedy that we need to codify into an ethical principle, but a material fact out of which we need to weave the dynamic of political action. Politics is indeterminate and without guarantees. But this does not mean that the indeterminacy has to become a moral horizon. Instead, indeterminacy functions as the motor that renders politics inexhaustible and confronts it with obstacles that demand specific responses. Far from conforming to the reflective carefulness of civility, politics is like the uncivil act of flooding, unleashed by the Operation Alaska Flood.
18 months.
Yo, thank you, Comrade Nell. Wherein hierarchies are flooded with the deluge of popular energy, a deluge that listens to nothing but its own indultating waves. And that brings us to the end of that chapter, comrades.